Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our first Liberty Post-Election Insiders Briefing titled The Way Forward, Hope for Religious Liberty in Light of the Election. And we're so happy that you've joined us here this evening. So many of you on the call have been supporters for years, but for anyone new, I wanted to take a moment to briefly introduce us. First Liberty is the largest legal organization in the nation solely dedicated to defending and protecting religious liberty in America. So tonight we'll first review President-elect Trump's impact on religious liberty through appointment to the Supreme Court and federal courts, along with executive orders. Next, we'll then discuss First Liberty's plan of action in light of new opportunities opening. And at the end, we'll have an open Q&A session where we can address some of your questions. But before we get started, I'd like to take a moment and review a few housekeeping items. First of all, to avoid any background noise, all calls will be on mute. Also, you can communicate with us by using the chat box on the right side of your screen. You can use this to submit questions or comments throughout the webinar and then later during the Q&A session. And you may also use the chat box for any technical issues that we can help address. And lastly, a recording of tonight's briefing with slides and audio will be available after the event and sent to you via email that you are welcome to share with friends and family. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speakers for this evening. Kelly Shackelford is President, CEO, and Chief Counsel for First Liberty. He is a constitutional scholar who has argued before the United States Supreme Court, testified before the U.S. House and Senate, and has won a number of landmark cases. Kelly's on the board of the U.S. Supreme Court Historical Society and earned his law degree from Baylor University. We also have Ken Klukowski, who is our Senior Counsel and Director of Strategic Affairs, officing in the Washington, D.C. area. Ken is a legal scholar, author, and journalist with Breitbart News. He earned his law degree from George Mason University and served as a law clerk in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. And I'm Christine Tang, your host for this evening. I serve as Associate Counsel for First Liberty on the media team and graduated with my law degree from Southern Methodist University. So we'll go ahead and get started with our first question for Kelly and Ken. Our first question is, what does a Trump win mean for religious liberty?
Well, it's really pretty incredible what it means. It's like we just had 1,000 doors open of opportunities. And it's in a lot of different areas. We're talking about, I think everybody's aware of judicial appointments to the Supreme Court and what that'll mean for religious liberty, but there's also the lower courts. There's executive orders that can be repealed. There's executive orders that can be passed. There's things as commander-in-chief that can be done. There's legislation that can be passed. I mean, there's just, we can talk about all these things, but literally everything just changed. And because it's not just a President-elect Trump, it's also a Republican House and Senate where there's pieces of religious liberty legislation that has not been able to go through that now would be open. And that's in addition to, just even talking about religious freedom, the rhetoric, the discussion that's going to go on. So it's really probably the most incredible window of opportunity for advancing and restoring religious freedom in massive ways that any of us have seen in many, many decades. And so, Ken, do you have any additional comments on that? I'd love to hear your comments as well.
Well, absolutely, and I agree with everything that you're saying, Kelly, and welcome everyone joining us today. This is, I think, a very important and timely conversation because I think we get that question day in and day out, and yeah, I think we see it on several fronts. The single biggest impact with religious liberty is, as Kelly said, President Trump's appointments to the U.S. Supreme Court, not just for the seat left vacant by the death of the late, great Justice Antonin Scalia, but also the significant likelihood that we could see another 2 Supreme Court vacancies over this presidential term, which could put us in a position regarding support for religious liberty that, frankly, the United States has not seen in decades, and I mean multiple decades. There has not been a conservative majority on the U.S. Supreme Court since 1936. It's been a full, literal 80 years. And so the idea of 3 good picks to the U.S. Supreme Court would put us in territory that none of us have seen since the advent of serious aggressive secularism in American society. Beyond that, there are certainly judicial appointments to the lower courts. There are executive actions that the president can do, mainly to undo executive actions that were taken by President Obama that violated people's religious liberty rights. And then there's also issues regarding legislation, and beyond that, the president's top appointments to certain key positions in the federal government. All of those will have a tremendous impact on religious liberty.
So our second question is, how might Trump-appointed justices affect the Supreme Court?
This is going to be a huge impact, and I think it's one of the main reasons why many people voted for candidate Trump, now President-elect Trump, is because of the Supreme Court. We have a chart for those who are on, visually. I know some are probably just on audibly, but that shows you the justices and when they were appointed and where they are. But the basic summaries, I think most people are aware of this. You have 3 liberal justices on the court right now. You have 3 conservatives and 1 who's considered a moderate, who sometimes is conservative and sometimes goes the other way on certain issues. Some people would call it 4-4. The first appointment will be a replacement of Justice Scalia. And so that's going to be significant because there are a number of cases that are 5-4, especially in our area of religious freedom, but even beyond that, that now will be preserved most likely. For instance, the Hobby Lobby case, where the government was the Supreme Court was literally deciding whether you lost your religious freedom if you went into business. That was a 5-4 win, but now with a replacement of Justice Scalia with another strong conservative jurist, that will be preserved. Think of our Salazar case, where they literally had ordered a bag put over the Veterans Memorial Cross. Again, we won that 5-4. That would have switched with a different justice appointment. So we've got a lot of things that are being preserved. The Galloway case, the right to pray before government meetings, all these things are really impacted. But what's really going to be significant, as Ken was referencing, is the next appointment after that and maybe the next one after that. Because now you are moving even a further step. Now you've got cases which maybe were 5-4 and we feel like in the wrong way that can be overturned. And now you're really solidifying. And I'll just say this before I pass it on to Ken, because I know Ken will have some thoughts on this as well. But this has impact immediately. We have cases right now at the Federal Court of Appeals, and I'll talk a little bit later maybe about one of those, but one of those cases just changed from probably going to be a defeat if Hillary Clinton were president and we're appointing this justice, to now where the odds are huge that we're going to have a victory at the Supreme Court. So there's an immediate impact already. And then as these justices began to be appointed, it could be more and more significant. And again, probably setting the court, this president probably will set the court for the next 30 years if President Trump has 2 or 3 appointments and chooses the kind of justices that are from the list that he pre-cleared earlier that the Federal Society and other friends of ours had said were good judges. So, Ken, your thoughts on the Supreme Court?
Well, I agree with everything you say, and I'll focus on one point in particular that I think I'm very excited about, and I would imagine that our supporters would be as well. And that is, without going through years of Establishment Clause jurisprudence, is those of us who litigate in the field know that the Supreme Court really started to go sideways on this issue in the 1960s. And in 1971, the court tried to systematize a test that would explain the wrong turns that they were taking, but also preserve things they wanted to preserve. It was something called the Lemon Test. It was a complete disaster. And so 18 years later, after the balance of the court shifted back and forth, finally in 1989, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor was the deciding vote, the 5th vote, in a case that adopted what's called the endorsement test. And for all of you on the phone, whenever you hear on the news that a federal court struck down something, whether it's a Christmas display or a cross in a war memorial or anything of that sort, you'll hear the phrase, because the court held it was an unconstitutional endorsement of religion. That test, the endorsement test, was invented out of whole cloth in the 1980s. Now, that was a 5-4 decision. The 4 dissenting justices were the 3 conservatives on the court at the time and Justice Anthony Kennedy, who wrote a magnificent, very conservative dissent, where he went on to say, no, that is a hopelessly subjective case, that any sort of government action that touches upon religion, you can find someone who thinks the government's endorsing religion. That can't be what the Constitution requires. He said, instead, the Establishment Clause is only violated when the government is coercing a person to participate in a religious activity that violates their conscience. And he says, and where there's no coercion, the First Amendment does not stop the government from doing whatever it is it's doing. Now, that case involved a Christmas display in a courthouse. And essentially, he was saying, look, no one is making you bow to the nativity display. No one's making you pray to it. No one's making you give money to it. If you don't like it, don't look at it. But as long as the government is not coercing anyone, the Establishment Clause does not erect some sort of anti-faith barrier. That is extremely exciting because that is the historically grounded understanding of the Establishment Clause. In the case that Kelly mentioned from 2 years ago, Town of Greece versus Galloway, Kennedy made clear that that's what he believes should be the rule that governs all Establishment Clause cases. So I think we are poised, even before we have another pick on the Supreme Court, if President Trump just restores a good, sound originalist to Justice Scalia's seat and leaves Justice Kennedy the swing vote, I think we have the votes to officially repudiate the endorsement test and adopt this historically grounded coercion standard. And if that would happen, it would be the single largest restoration of religious liberty in America in over a quarter century. It's extremely exciting.
And I would point out, when we say that the court, there will probably be another maybe 2 or 3 justices, we're talking about just in the 4-year term. Of course, there could be an 8-year term for President-elect Trump. We don't know. But the point is, we're talking about very significant things. And I would point out, we would have loved to have input into President Obama's appointments to the Supreme Court, but he wasn't really taking our input to make a difference. There's a difference here. We do have input into these judges and justices and the types of people. And let me just throw out a hypothetical. For instance, if there were somebody that was on the list of President-elect Trump that everybody thought was good, but that actually really wasn't, had some real problems, that's the type of thing where we might speak behind the scenes and say, you know what, this is not a judge you want, and here's the information. And if that were to occur, President-elect Trump and his team might say, you know what, we don't want that person on the list. We want a really good judge. I'm not telling you whether that has happened or not, but I'm saying that communication is now something that's going to happen. So we're going to be able to have input and influence on making sure we get good justices, good judges in the courts below as well. And that's going to affect things for, way in the future, as Ken gave you just one example on the test that they would use on religious freedom. But we're going to see this in all the other areas of constitutional laws, whether it's the Second Amendment or all the other issues. These judges who really do restrict themselves to the Constitution are really going to change things as they really go back to the original documents, the original Constitution, the original intent of our founders, and really we're going to see a big change because we haven't had that since the 1930s. Next question. I think we're probably ought to jump to the next one.
Great, Kevin. Well, what about other federal lower courts?
Yeah, that's something that people don't think about, and actually probably the bigger impact will be the lower courts. And by lower, I mean Federal Court of Appeals, the federal district courts. President Trump will be picking hundreds of federal judges. these are appointed for life. Most cases never make it to the Supreme Court. Only 1%, even of the ones that they ask to go to the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court takes. So most of the cases end up at those lower federal courts, and that's the final decision. And there's been 8 years of President Obama putting judges in those positions. So this is something that really changed. It's going to take a long time, but it's something that will begin to be changed the moment these appointments start. And again, we have had former volunteer attorneys of ours who have won these appointments and been appointed to these federal courts and courts of appeals. And let me tell you, there's no better judge in our view than somebody who's so committed to the Constitution and to religious freedom that they would give their time and their practice to do these cases. These judges, when they become judges, we found that they're spectacular judges, and really, you never have to worry about them doing something crazy because you know they're solid beforehand. Now we're going to have hundreds of these slots filled, and those are the kind of people that we're going to do everything in our power to make sure become the next judges, and therefore will affect the cases into the future. But and we've got, I think right now we have 7. I think we might have a chart on this if you're looking visually. We have, I think it's 7 cases right now at the Court of Appeals, at the Federal Court of Appeals, right below the Supreme Court, waiting to go up to the Supreme Court. So we're all over the country in these lower courts right now on our way up to the Supreme Court, in addition to a case that we're filing in the Supreme Court, which many are aware of, the Sterling case, the Marine who was court-martialed because she did not remove a scripture verse from her personal work area. Ken, I know you actually were a clerk for one of the most famous federal judges in the country at the Federal Court of Appeals. So talk about the lower federal courts as well.
Yeah, happy to do so. There are 179 federal appeals courts spread across the 12 geographical circuits that the country is divided into. And of course, federal appeals are typically heard by 3 judge panels. Now, currently, of those 179 seats, and then you have semi-retired judges who stick around as well. So I think there's about 210 federal appeals judges right now. There are currently, I believe, 15 vacancies on the U.S. Courts of Appeals. And now President Trump will have the authority to nominate for the Senate's confirmation consideration the lawyers who are going to fill each of those seats. Now, historically, a president gets about 40 federal appeals court appointments during a 4-year period. So a president during a 2-term presidency replaces almost half of the federal appeals judges on the bench. But as Kelly said, because these are 3-judge panels, things work on averages. And so it'll take us longer to see the impact of President Trump on the courts of appeals. It won't be the massive sea change, or in this case, the restoration of balance on the court that we'll see when a good conservative is nominated to fill Justice Scalia's seat. But you will see that impact snowball over the next 4 years, and God willing, beyond that as well.
Great. Well, that was an excellent analysis of how the Supreme Court and lower federal courts could be impacted. So our next question is, what could President-elect Trump do for religious liberty via executive action?
Well, this is a really important one because this is what a lot of people aren't thinking about. Legislation and even appointing judges and other appointments there's another part of Congress that is interacting with this. But executive action, I mean, and certainly President-elect Trump is aware of this, is something that the chief executive does without any help from anyone. And so it's something they can do immediately. So there are executive orders that can immediately be repealed, rescinded. There are executive orders that can immediately be passed. As commander-in-chief, President Trump can immediately act as commander-in-chief and begin to do things. So let me give you just a couple of quick examples, and again, I want to throw it to Ken for his ideas on this. I know this is something he's thought about a lot. But let's take commander-in-chief. What if as commander-in-chief, President Trump were to say, I'm going to issue an order right here, and these attacks upon our chaplains in the military is going to end. and let me lay out for you the protections we're going to have for our chaplains. That's something that happens immediately. Doesn't have to go through Congress. It's something that the commander-in-chief can do immediately. Let's talk about, everybody's talking about Obamacare and how they're going to repeal Obamacare and how we have to wait for them to repeal Obamacare. Well, there are lawsuits that we're in right now, for instance, against Chuck Swindoll's Insight for Living. You've heard of the Little Sisters of the Poor, where they're actually in lawsuits with the HHS, the federal government, because they're trying to force them to violate their faith through Obamacare. There's also for-profit businesses that we're representing that are in the same situation. They're in these lawsuits. There are new lawsuits about to start, which we haven't told you about yet, because of new provisions of Obamacare that are going to come after, like, religious hospitals and everybody else. President Trump could immediately tell the HHS, these attacks on religious freedom are over, and I am withdrawing all these lawsuits. I am issuing an order that you will not be involved in this type of persecution of people, whether it's the Little Sisters of the Poor or someone else, through this Obamacare. So again, we don't even have to wait for the repeal. As the chief executive and the HHS being underneath his authority, he certainly has the authority to order the HHS to stop these attacks on religious freedom, which were totally unnecessary in the first place. So there's a myriad of these examples. This is what I'm telling you about how many doors of opportunity are open for protecting religious freedom and immediately correcting things. But Ken, I'd love to hear your comments as well.
Well, I think let's take the example, Kelly, of Obamacare. Now, we've since learned, well, first of all, Obamacare, President Trump has said that he will repeal it and replace it, and I think that was a big factor in his victory Tuesday night. I think the American people are fed up with this. That's outside our issue, but there appears to be extreme dissatisfaction with the whole government takeover of healthcare that we have in Obamacare. But Congress, in writing that, and this was a liberal Democratic-controlled Congress at the time that wrote it, they just included innocuous language that employers' health care plans would have to cover preventive care. And then a couple of years after that, that's when President Obama's Secretary of HHS, who is staunchly pro-abortion and never been a friend to religious liberty, issued a regulation interpreting preventive care to mean access to abortion-related products and services. And that's how we got the form of economic aggression against Hobby Lobby, against the Little Sisters of the Poor, that all of a sudden this seemingly plain vanilla language is suddenly a mandate that you're going to have to become complicit in abortion. Now, even the far left was nervous about that. Media reports came out about how there were spirited discussions in the Obama White House about whether they were going to declare war on the Catholic Church and America's evangelical pro-life community. And they decided to go ahead and do it. But when you have that kind of language that takes, that kind of order that takes plain vanilla statutory language and reads all of these mandates into it that are so aggressive and such infringements on people of faith, you're absolutely right that can be undone by executive action as easily as it was done by executive action to begin with.
Well, Kelly and Ken, can you share a little bit with us of what is First Liberty's plan in light of President-elect Trump's win?
Well, it's really exciting. We were prepared for either result in the election. And we had plans specifically laid out, but the myriad of opportunities we now have because of the election of President-elect Trump and a number of the things he's promised, a number of things he said, the people around him, just different opportunities that are now going to be available, is really, it's beyond anything we ever really expected. Let me just give you the quick summary. We're talking about appointments to the Supreme Court, which we will be speaking into and have been speaking into. We're talking about appointments to the Federal Court of Appeals, to the lower courts, hundreds of federal judges. Okay, we're talking about cases that we have moving towards the Supreme Court, and now new cases which we can now file that we know that if things go and he gets that second appointment, by the time our case gets there, we will be establishing precedent that probably will stay in place for at least 40 years. So the cases, the Department of Justice itself, which will begin to fight, instead of being an enemy to religious freedom, like they have in numerous cases, Hobby Lobby case and others, they will now be filing amicus briefs on our side. They will be, supporting religious freedom in the Constitution. And this is not even to mention legislation. There's a lot of pro-religious freedom legislation on specific issues, on broader issues, that now will be able to pass the United States Congress and be signed into law. And that doesn't even include the discussion that will now be going on as these things are happening and how people will get educated on religious freedom. And we can really have the bully pulpit of the presidency as well as things going on in Congress. We're going to have some real education on the importance of religious liberty. Again, that's just the tip of the iceberg. I can just tell you we've had we have so many specific ideas and things that we can do that our biggest battle is we're trying to figure out how we can get the new resources and get the new people on board to be able to take advantage of what we think is at least a 2-year window. There's a 2-year window before there's another election where, for instance, the Senate could change hands. We have got to move in that 2 years because the opportunities are incredible for what we could do to expand and to restore religious freedom. Ken, any additional thoughts on the plan?
I agree that this is a very urgent time. This is a target-rich environment, but if we've learned one thing, if history has taught us anything in this regard, it's that we need to make hay while the sun is shining. We need to strike while the iron is hot. And right now it's like a clearance sale, and the prices have been slashed in half, but the sale is, for 24 hours, and it's just a matter of getting the resources to be able to scoop as many of those deals off the rack as we can in that one-day clearance sale. Right now, it is a very favorable environment, and we want to charge up that hill and put as many victories on the scoreboard as possible, as soon as possible, to lock that in before things change.
And I would point out, in addition to the House and the Senate and the presidency, what happened in the states was incredible as well. You now have, I think it was 32 governors that are now Republican of the states, and you have legislatures becoming much more amenable to religious freedom. So there are opportunities all the way up and down now that, again, those are windows that might close 2 years from now. But right now they're open in ways we've never seen. Certainly many of us, like me, have never seen in my lifetime. So it really is an incredible and exciting time. My only trepidation is taking advantage of the opportunity that's before us. So I know we're going to, go to some questions. So I'll pass it on to Christine for those.
So we'll take some time now to address some questions from our audience. So the first question we have is, what are the downsides, if any, to this new era that we're entering into?
It's kind of what I just referenced. I was actually in a conversation yesterday with the Lord, and I was like, this is just incredible as we're looking at these opportunities. And I thought, but I really feel like I can't take the people who work here now and are working on cases on their way to the Supreme Court and pull them off to be researching possible justices to the Supreme Court and what their background is. So in other words, if we're going to do all these additional things, we've got to have new people and new resources. And I really felt like we would almost need, this is what I said to the staff. I said, I feel like we need $4.5 million tomorrow to be able to handle what's ahead of us. And I don't want to regret 2 years from now if the window closes that we didn't do this, because there are so many specific opportunities for us to have long-term impact way beyond our lives into our kids and our grandkids. So that to me is the only real the other downside, I guess, and I'll let Ken see if he's thought of anything as well, would be making sure that President Trump follows through on what he said he would do, on the commitments he made to religious freedom. And there were numerous ones. A number of our cases were even mentioned. Coach Kennedy was mentioned, the military, a number of our military cases were with him just a month ago as they had a large military meeting. Of course, I could go on and on, but following through, with the commitments that he made. And again, a lot of that will depend upon the appointments made and the people around President-elect Trump, and that those be good people. And they're certainly in the process of making those decisions now through the transition and these types of things where they're figuring out how to get all their cabinet members, how to get all their members up and down the row, which is, I think, 4,400 appointments we're talking about. But these are commitments that were made. They were things of heart. A number of them President-elect Trump brought up himself, like the Johnson Amendment. And it's just a matter of following through on those, and some incredible things are going to happen. But we've also got a lot of additional ideas with a favorable setting that we think will go through and will make a really big difference. Ken, your thoughts on the downsides, possible downsides?
Well, I think that, anytime you elect a new president of the United States, that has such wide-reaching implications across every subject matter, across every policy matter. I think that what you find is with the executive branch, very few issues rise to the presidential level, and that is why personnel is policy. And it's just absolutely imperative to get good people around President Trump to make sure that these issues, that the ones that do reach the presidential level, are coming to him the right way through the right people, where the issues are framed the right way so that he can understand what the stakes are. Because, as you said, he expressed a great deal of concern and sympathy for people of faith here in this country regarding violations of religious liberty. I mean, he spoke more explicitly and more strongly about that than I think any major party nominee that we've heard in a number of years. And so it's a matter of making sure that things that don't rise to the presidential level are being decided, whether it's the cabinet level or below that, being decided by people who have the right views on these issues, and for actions that only the president can take. It's so important, again, to have those same people in the right position to make sure that they are the ones to elevate that matter to the president's attention in a way where he can understand this is what's going on, this is how it relates to the promises you gave the American people during the campaign, and therefore this is what you can do in this situation to protect religious liberty.
Great. Well, just a reminder to our audience, feel free to use the chat box in the right-hand corner of your screen. We're getting some more questions now, and our next one is, what are the top 3 executive orders that could be reversed by Trump to do us the most good?
Well, there's a lot of those. There's the big, really overreach within, you think of the Department of Labor, you think of the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, of course, the chaos that's been created in education, where now, there's all this confusion and the girl, a male being able to go into a girl's locker room, and then that being applied even to religious entities. Those are things now that easily those executive orders, those what was referred to a lot of times like SOGI executive orders, sexual orientation, gender identity, which have all kinds of implications on religious freedom, again, could be stopped immediately. What should happen, the way our government is supposed to work is, if you're going to do this type of intense, really it's legislation, and you need the back and forth of understanding what the implications are to these things and trying to deal with those implications. But that would be, I think, a number of executive orders that really are right on the top of the list. But I know Ken probably has some other ideas as well. There's so many choices there of things that could be done, from the immigration executive order that has been stopped by the courts to a number of others that were certainly over the line.
Yeah, that's right. I think there's so many issues. if you choose to go around Congress and just do everything by executive action, you're racking up an awful large target-rich environment in the event that a new chief executive comes in who has very different views about those issues. I haven't yet sorted them out in order of priority because there's just been a number, and it's the ones that you've mentioned, Kelly, that are just such egregious violations of religious liberty. I mean, whoever thought that you would try and tell a bunch of Catholic nuns that if they're not paying for abortion-related stuff, you're going to issue crippling fines that'll make them close their doors. I mean, these things were just inconceivable a decade ago in this country. And so I don't know what list I would give in terms of number one, number two, number three, but any of the ones that you mentioned could be on that list, certainly with the nuns and the Little Sisters of the Poor. I mean, as a default setting, that may be number one. And in that regard, it may be, there's really more than one way to go about that. One way is that you could actually rescind a regulation. The other is that you could just issue a very broad conscience protection as an add-on to a current regulatory system where pretty much anyone who raises their hand and says, you know, that would violate my faith, then their faith would be respected. But it looks like President Trump has such a priority to get Obamacare repealed. If the statute is repealed, then all of those executive actions would fall with it.
Great. Well, moving on to our next question. Trump does not have a conservative constitutional track record. What plans do you have to help influence his direction as president?
Well, I think the greatest influence is, and I think you have to wait, and we're going to have to wait and see how President Trump, acts as president. I think there are some people that think that it's about sort of what his past is, which has been all over the map a little bit, right? There's certainly been growth in another number of areas, but I think the most widely accepted view is that President Trump is not an expert on a lot of these issues, including the Constitution, hasn't spent a lot of time into that. I mean, I know he's committed to the Second Amendment. That's been something very important to him. A lot of these other issues, whether it's his commitment to pro-life judges and all these things that he said were more recent. But I think most people know that he wants to appoint people who are experts in those issues. And so take on the Constitution. When he was asked, in fact, I asked him this question in front of all the national leaders. I was asked to take this area and ask him a question. When I said, tell us how you're going to pick these justices at the Supreme Court, how you're going to pick these judges below, who are you going to rely upon? Because I know you don't know these judges or who to choose. And he admitted that. He said, it's true. He said, but I'm going to really depend upon the Federal Society, the Heritage Foundation. He began listing groups like ours who are committed to really a faithful approach to the Constitution. And he even began to release a list. He released his first list that his Supreme Court justice that replaces Scalia was going to come from this list. So he has really walked down the road on this. I think you're going to see this not only on the constitutional areas, I think you're going to see this across the board. So rather than appointing himself as the expert on economic issues, I think you're going to see him defer and maybe bring in a person like a Steve Moore or a Larry Kudlow. We've seen this in a number of different areas where kind of CEO-like, where you bring in experts to do those things, and they are very faithful to, for instance, the Constitution, because that's something they really understand. They know how to do well. And so I'm hopeful. And certainly we're going to be doing everything we can. We certainly have the ability to speak into this. And if people doubt that, they think, well, he's not going to feel bound to anybody. I would disagree with that. The election that just occurred was a record number of evangelical votes. Record number. And 84% of those people voted for Donald Trump. And that's why he has often talked about that issue of evangelicals, because he knows that is a very significant, it's a key for him. He has no chance without that. The Catholic vote was in his favor as well, 52% to 45%. You add those two groups together and you start messing with religious freedom, you're pretty much living a death wish as far as any sort of future for you. So I do think that he's going to listen. He's going to care about those things. And I think I've seen some evolution on that and a real concern on that as well. But Ken, I'd love to have your thoughts as well.
Yeah, the easy answer is that he has no track record on constitutional issues because he has never been in public office before. So it's the guy's a businessman. He's 70 years old. He spent his whole life as a businessman and has, over the decades, built a multi-billion-dollar empire. But in that regard, you know, he's learning all these issues now. So you say, okay, if someone's never been governor, never been senator, sure, there's not going to be a paper trail of previous actions. In fact, he is the first president in American history who has never held any sort of public office. Every president we've had has either been an elected or appointed official or has been a military officer. So any way you look at it, public service. He is the first one we've had out of 45 presidents who is entirely coming from a career in the private sector. So when we don't have that kind of paper trail, we say, okay, well, what do we have to go on? Well, we have the very strongly worded statements that he's made to the American people. He says he's going to appoint pro-life justices to the Supreme Court. You know, the previous Republican presidents never used the phrase pro-life justices. They talked about fidelity to the Constitution. They talked about people who will interpret the law, not make the law from the bench. I mean, you got this language, all of which was good, but it was far less explicit. President-elect Trump said, I will appoint pro-life justices. He's gone on to say there is a war against Christianity in America. We need to protect Christianity. I mean, read his speech from Liberty University, for example. I mean, just you could not get bolder words in that regard. And where he singles out issues like Merry Christmas. He said, yo, we're going to start saying Merry Christmas again. So, I mean, I think you see someone who is looking to not at all walk on eggshells, that he is making very as bold of statements regarding the protection of religious liberty as we have ever heard from a U.S. president in modern times. And so I think at this point, he couldn't have done more at this point in that regard. He could not have said more than he has said on the issue of protecting religious liberty. And now it's a matter of, as he comes into office, now I believe we're going to see him back that up with action.
And I'd say I really do appreciate the question, because I think it highlights the importance of First Liberty and I mean, if there was no First Liberty for the next 2 years, I think a lot of things that we think are going to happen wouldn't be able to happen. But because we're there to assure, to encourage, to make sure these things happen, I think we're going to see a lot of these. And that's part of our role. Certainly this isn't just the only issue on his plate, but it's certainly something we can make sure is being moved forward in numerous ways. And that's something we're going to be really committed to.
We have two questions from the audience that I'll try to combine. So the first one is, will the Senate be able to actually vote on new conservative judges with the 60-vote threshold? And how likely is a filibuster of the appointees, and what is Plan B if so?
Let me, Kelly, if I can,
go ahead.
I'll jump in. Yeah, I'll jump in on that one. First of all, the 60-vote threshold has been abolished for everything except the Supreme Court. And this is a matter of be careful what you wish for. You know, when President Obama wanted to get some judicial activists on the court and Republicans were holding the line, the majority leader at that time, Harry Reid, invoked what was called the nuclear option and just abolished from the Senate rules the filibuster for all presidential appointments, executive branch and judicial branch, except for the Supreme Court. So let's set aside the Supreme Court for a moment to say now, as long as you have 50 votes, because not even 51, if you have 50 votes, the vice president gets to break the tie. And I can tell you right now how Vice President Mike Pence is going to vote when it comes to those issues. If you have at least 50 senators, you can confirm anyone. Now, regarding the Supreme Court, in that regard, I think that's going to be a pitched battle. I think there is no one that would meet President Trump's promise to the American people. That would be an acceptable choice to the new Democratic minority leader, who's going to be Charles Schumer from New York. He's very passionate about wanting liberal judicial activists on the bench. So I think that is going to be a fight that is going to go on for some time. And I believe that if President Trump sticks to his guns, that eventually he will get a good nominee through to the U.S. Supreme Court. I believe if he and Chuck Schumer both give it everything they've got, that I believe Chuck Schumer runs out of fuel long before Donald Trump does. I think we've seen in this campaign, especially over last week, it's like Donald Trump doesn't sleep. I mean, that guy appears to just be full of adrenaline at all times, and he is dogged. He is persistent. He is tenacious, and if he applies that same tenacity to a Supreme Court confirmation fight, then no matter how long it needs to take, I believe he's going to win.
And I agree, and I would point out that we'll see if this is correct or not. I would guess that this first appointment won't be as difficult as the one after, because this is a Scalia seat, and these are promises that not only did candidate Trump make if he were president, but he even set out a list. So certainly the other side's going to fight at everything, but I don't think they want to, fight unreasonably and over a Scalia seat and end up causing the nuclear option to be used against them immediately on Supreme Court nominees, which I think could very well happen. But I agree with Ken. I think he's going to get these through. He knows, again, if you look at the polling of evangelicals, the number one reason that they voted for Trump was the Supreme Court. So when they tested conservative evangelicals, the Barna research that's been done over the past few months, that was the number one issue. So again, you abandon that issue at the peril of ever having a chance to have your constituency behind you again. And so again, I think it's something he's very committed to, and I think they'll follow through on. And again, they have the numbers, and this is a Scalia seat, and so I do think the war will really occur on that second appointment, assuming there's a second appointment soon after, whether it's Ginsburg or even Kennedy or Breyer, because now we're talking about moving a liberal or a moderate to a conservative seat, and certainly the liberal side knows what that means.
Well, it's 7:50, but we'll try to take two more questions. So we have a question that says, is repealing the Johnson Amendment within the realm of possibility?
Absolutely, repealing the Johnson Amendment is within the realm of possibility. For those who don't know what the Johnson Amendment is, it's an amendment that was really snuck through with nobody knowing by LBJ because he didn't like some nonprofits who had spoken out against him. It really had nothing to do with religion. But when they put it through, it took not just secular nonprofits, but it included all religious groups, including churches, who now had these restrictions allegedly on what they could do in endorsing a candidate. The reality with the Johnson Amendment is it really doesn't restrict very much. Really very little that churches would really care about, but there's a fear factor from it that scares a lot of pastors and a lot of churches into self-censorship. And so that's why it is important to get rid of it. And it would be very easy to do. We have some legislative language that would make it simple. And I do think, again, if it doesn't happen when you have a president who promised it and a Republican House and a Republican Senate, then I don't think you could ever get it done. So I do feel pretty confident that that is something that very much could get done, although I think there's a lot more than that that would have real significance that can be done on religious freedom as well through the Congress. Ken, do you have anything additional to add on that?
Yeah, I think there's 2 points that you said that I want to highlight. And the first is that there's a chilling effect. As you said, the Johnson Amendment actually doesn't prohibit much. It just says that you can't be explicitly endorsing or opposing candidates for political office or political parties or specific legislation. I mean, it does nothing in and of itself. It does nothing to shackle or muzzle churches from speaking out about all the moral issues of the day, including naming names in terms of who is fighting for or against certain issues. But because the left has been so effective at indoctrinating the American people about the idea that there is some sort of mythical wall of separation between church and state, despite the fact that those words appear nowhere in the U.S. Constitution, many churches just assume that there's all sorts of stuff that they can't talk about. And so that's why the Johnson Amendment needs to be addressed, because churches need to be crystal clear aware that they can speak out. Now, the other point I would make is this, and that is that there's two ways to do it. One is to actually repeal the language that's there. But the other, because the language itself is actually just the language that applies to all charitable or educational nonprofits, you could also add language into the tax code that just makes explicit that that section does not apply to churches, houses of worship, etc. You could list, ministries, religious mission organizations. You could put this very broad language in that makes it clear that if you are a church or any sort of Christian organization or adherents of other faiths, that just none of these restrictions apply to you at all, and that would be the other way for people to understand that the church can re-engage the culture 100%.
Well, thank you all so much for sending in so many excellent questions. We'll take one final one. Does First Liberty have contacts in D.C. that will have access to influencers of President Trump?
Yes. We obviously can't name all those people. One of the people on the line, of course, today with us is, our lead attorney in the D.C. area who has been in D.C. for many years and certainly knows his way around there. It's Ken Klukowski. And in addition to Ken and myself, let's just say we have lots of connections in all kinds of ways and a lot of friends who are involved in this process and were with candidate Trump from very early on. And these are people who care about religious freedom. And so that's why we have been able to speak into a lot of these issues. That's why you saw President Trump, at the time, candidate Trump, tweeting about people like Coach Kennedy and how outrageous this is. So we've been speaking into these issues for a while, and we have great people and friends all throughout the organization and what will become the administration. So we definitely have friends in there, although a lot of decisions will be made here in the near future. I encourage people to pray for the people that are chosen, that are in the inner circle and are in the circles around, because it's very important that you have people speaking truth really close to you. But let's just say we have a lot of friends, and you can be encouraged by a lot of people who are going to have some of that influence. And this is not just theory. This is things that we've already been speaking into and already seen results and things happen as a result of. I guess I think the last thing we were going to do is I was just going to end up by summarizing for you real quickly. We're really excited about what we feel is a window of opportunity. And I say a window of opportunity because it could close in 2 years. 2 years from now, usually whoever wins the presidency, 2 years later, there's a little bit of a backlash. And if the Senate is close, which it is right now, it could move and things could change there. So all we know we have right now is 2 years to actually move on, and I mean this, hundreds of opportunities, specific ideas and opportunities we have, any one of which could affect, hundreds of millions of Americans and their religious freedom. And I wish I could just sit here and go through all these things. If you sat in the room with us and realized what can be done, and some of which without huge amounts of effort, you'd realize this is a huge opportunity. And so I would ask you to pray for us. There's really three things that I feel like we need. Number one, we need wisdom. We've got these opportunities, we've got these relationships, and we need wisdom on when to move and on what and in what order, because the impact and the possibilities are incredible. Number two, we need God's favor. I think that had a lot to do with a lot of what we've seen. I think God's given us grace to have some of these opportunities, and we need His favor to not have those doors closed and to be able to walk through those and do those the right way. And third, as I mentioned earlier, we need resources. So, and the best way I can describe it is we've got people here that are working on incredible cases on their way at the highest levels, one on the Supreme Court, 7 courts of appeals, all the other cases that are coming up the chain. And now we need to file a whole bunch of new cases because of the opportunity we have that can bring new precedents. We need new people that can be vetting all these judges and speaking into the process. And I'm not talking about Supreme Court. I'm talking about all the lower courts as well. We need people that are going to be in Congress making sure this religious freedom legislation gets through. We need to be speaking into the appointments to these key positions. I mean, I could go on and on. The point is, we can't take our current staff and do all these additional things. So we really do need, so I pray for us. I don't know how we get this kind of money this quickly, but I really need $4.5 million tomorrow. We need the money so we can begin bringing the people on and getting our office in D.C. in shape and getting to move on this, because we know we have 2 years, but we don't know if we have any more. And the things that can be done are pretty incredible. So I just say be encouraged, pray for us. We need all the prayer and wisdom and favor we can get. And I just want to thank you for being a part of First Liberty and what we're doing. I would say this is a unique time for us, but that's a massive understatement. I don't think there has ever been an opportunity like we have right now for religious freedom. And I'm not sure we'll ever have another one like this in our lifetime. So I just want to make sure we take advantage of the opportunity that we have. So be with us, stay with us, pray with us, and know that we're working on this and are really excited about what can happen. Thank you.
Well, this has been an excellent discussion, and we hope that it was both very educational and meaningful for you all. So please watch for an email with a recording of tonight's briefing that will include both the slides and the audio that you are welcome to share with friends and family. And on behalf of everyone at First Liberty Institute, thank you so much for joining us. Good night and God bless.